Yeah, really good. Yeah, we saw a leopard in the first 5 minutes.
Okay, we're live.
Fantastic.
We're about to go live now, so all good.
Okay, I'll wait just a few minutes before we kick off, and we're synced. So you had a good break.
Really good, thank you.
Good. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my international book club. And we're absolutely thrilled today to have Bob Wigley, the author of Born Digital, the story of a distracted generation, answering some of the questions that you've sent in. So please do send any questions you'd like to have asked into the chat function. And let me start by thanking Bob enormously for giving us his time and sharing just a little bit about our quite polymath of a guest, I would say. So Bob spent 25 years of his career working in banking, most recently the chairman of Merrill Lynch in Europe. About 10 years, he was invited onto the board of the Bank of England during the financial crisis, and he moved into backing youngsters in the tech industry, about which he's passionate, I guess, hence this book. He's also chair of UK Finance, which covers government, regulation, compliance, and the prevention of economic crime. He's a part-time lecturer and philanthropist too. So welcome, Bob. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So we start usually, Bob, with our other brilliant writers on the sort of the how, the why, the what. So how did you write this book? I read that this started with the first lockdown in the UK. Why did you write it? And then what did you want to have happen having written it? So the how, the why, and the what.
So I'm going to take the second question first. So we're on day 2 of lockdown. I've never had an office at home, deliberately so that I didn't work at home and could give some time to the kids. So I was in the kitchen. My wife had decided me being in the kitchen was a bad idea. So she said, you need to find somewhere else to work. I took myself into the dining room, stared at the wall for 10 minutes and thought, if I'm going to be here for 3 months, I need a project. And I'd had this book in my head. So I thought, right, okay, well, lockdown is the ideal time to write a book. Now, how did I write it? Well, the first thing I did was I Googled the chapter headings that I was intending to put into the book. And then I completely panicked because what I discovered was that someone had written an entire book, or indeed several people in some cases had written an entire book on every single one of the chapters that I was about to write. So I thought, oh God, maybe I'm not going to say anything new. So then I decided I better read all these books. So I had to read 35 books in a month. And basically what I discovered was that 32 of them were not very good. 3 of them were great. And to cut a long story short, though, having read all 35, I reckoned I probably knew more about this subject than anybody in the world for at least 10 minutes. And I was absolutely clear that I had something new to say because all of the books were pretty analytical. A lot of them were very research based. They were quite academic. They were, in most cases, I said, not very interesting in a sense. And they didn't come to any conclusions or make any practical business suggestions about how to move forward. They just analyzed the problem. And I wanted to write a book that was positive about Generation Z, put Generation Z's use of technology in context, and came up with some practical advice and solutions for the future. So I think that probably answers at least 2 of your questions. What did I want to happen? Well, we'll come to it, I guess, in a minute. But at the end of the book, I talk about what Gen Z could do to control its own use of digital technologies and be more canny about that use. I put in the book ideas for parents, how they could support their children in this exercise, for what educators could do, for what the big techs might do, the software design industry might do, and ultimately probably what governments have to do. So that, I think, probably addresses your 3 questions.
Brilliant. So for everyone, you can see people joining. We're in our international book club with Bob Wigley, the author of Born Digital. And I agree, Bob, some of the practical suggestions in the book make it very special. But I also loved the amount of data, the references in the book. But people have asked for you to talk about the problem of identity, anonymity, EID, and age verification. What are some of the solutions? And I think you've got some exciting news on multimodal dynamic private age assistance. It sounds like an IBM working name, that one, from a Swiss company. So talk to us about identity, anonymity, and age verification.
Okay, so let's start with the problem. Today we can roam around the internet using a false identity, using someone else's name or an imaginary name. And in the context of some of the bad behavior that goes on the internet, it's highly topical, given recent news events. But whether we're talking about cyberbullying, the spreading of hate speech, the spreading of fake news, or God forbid, technology-assisted child sexual abuse, anonymity is an assistant to all these bad behaviors. We don't allow our children to buy alcohol without ID. You can't go on an airplane without ID. You can't buy controlled drugs without ID. You can't go to a nightclub without ID. Why on earth does anybody think it's a good idea to allow people to roam around the internet being someone else or being no one and engage in all these activities and all the things that are, as it were, prevented by having to provide ID are available on the internet and more. So that sort of hopefully encapsulates the problem. And anonymity is the friend of bad behavior.
Yeah.
Now, the answer to that is to require the big tech platforms to identify you when you sign onto their platforms. And here's like a really critical thing to understand. Some people will say the two big defenses to anonymity are that some people, so for example, celebrities, don't want to self-identify on the web. And if they had to, it would in effect bar them from using the internet because they'd get pestered the whole time by people they didn't want to talk to. And so allowing them anonymity is the only way they can access the internet. Now, the thing about that is that I have no problem with people setting up an Insta profile, for example, in a different name, as long as Instagram knows who they actually are. And here's the point. It's not about you presenting yourself on the web as who you are. It's about the platform knowing who you are. Because if you then spread hate speech, spread fake news, you cyberbully someone, or God forbid, you try and groom them, and that victim complains to the platform, if the platform knows who you are, they can do something about it. They can block you, they can report you to the authorities. If they don't know who you are, there's very little that the big tech platform can do. Now, where we've ended up, which gets us into age assurance, is since governments won't require citizens to identify themselves to the platform, right, against which there really is no justifiable defense, in my view, or no justifiable argument why anybody would object to the platform knowing who they were, apart from one possible argument, which is people say, well, in totalitarian regimes, it gives the government, the bad, as it were, government, even more power than it already has. My view on that is, I don't know why we would allow what happens to people in totalitarian regimes to be more important than the adolescent well-being of our children or the mental and physical well-being of our children. Yes. So I'm afraid I'm not a buyer of that argument either. Totalitarian regimes will find a way of doing what they want to do, whether you have anonymity on the web or not. So those are the two big defenses. I don't buy either of them. I think you should have to identify yourself to the platform, but governments are not prepared to impose that constraint at the moment. So where we've ended up is the idea of age assurance, meaning at least if we know you're under 13 or under 18 or over 18, then platforms can take certain steps to protect you. Now, that means then the big tech platforms need a way to age assure you. And the technology there has been slowly developing. The history has been that the platforms will use an image of you or potentially use a little bit of voice message from you to try and work out your age. The trouble with that is that one picture or one piece of voice message doesn't give a very accurate outcome. It might be as bad as 50%, particularly if you're an adolescent, where people obviously progress at very different rates. So the really exciting development, this comes from a company called Privately in Switzerland, which I've backed and work with. They've come up with this thing called dynamic private multimodal age assurance. And that very quickly, what that means is the following. You download an app onto your laptop or your mobile. It is constantly looking at the video that you are in any event recording, let's say if you're using TikTok or Instagram or you're conversing through video WhatsApp. It's looking at and listening to your voice in the messages that you send. And it's triangulating between the two. So it's using multiple images, multiple pieces of voice, triangulating between the two using AI. You come up with a very high probability of being able to accurately age assure someone, even if they're an adolescent. And the really exciting bit is that if today, let's say Google or Facebook wanted to age assure you, they take that information onto their own server and they do the analysis in their operating environment. Our app does all the analysis within the app. Nothing leaves the phone whatsoever. So not one single image, not one single piece of voice text leaves the phone. The only thing that leaves the phone is the conclusion. Now that is genuinely revolutionary, and it will remove, when it works at industrial scale, and we're in the ICO sandbox at the moment in the UK, it will remove the objection of the big techs to be able to say we can't accurately age assure you, because we will be able to provide them with very high probability age assurance. So that's the bottom line.
Great. So to remind you, we've had a surge of people joining from India, which is fantastic, and a couple of questions which I'll insert here. This is our international book club. We've got Robert Wigley with us talking about his Born Digital book. And one of the questions, well, a couple of questions on the same theme, Bob, which we didn't talk about before, but you I'm sure will be comfortable asking this, is, are there regions of the world that are less distracted, more distracted? I guess, seeing as these questioners are coming from India, though not specifically. Do you think this is a global, equally dispersed set of problems, or is there a geographical orientation that you would highlight?
Okay, so in general terms, the problem of distraction is absolutely a global problem. I think where you get cultural and national differences is on the particular nature of that distraction. So interestingly, in the most technologically advanced nations of the world as it comes to the internet, and I'm thinking probably ultimately of the Far East here, so places like Japan and China and Vietnam, there the problem is gaming. These are nations where gaming has become a major problem. And I always say that it's not about the amount of time you spend on a screen. Generation Z, as we know, is spending, let's say, 9 to 11 hours a day on its mobile, on its laptop, on its gaming console, on its iPad, okay, or watching Netflix. And it's not about the number of hours you spend, it's about what you do during those hours. If you're, for example, spending 4 or 5 hours educating yourself through some kind of education program, you're using YouTube to find information, you're using Google to find information, and let's say you're spending an hour a day on social media, you're spending an hour a day gaming, that's all fine, probably, for most people. If you're spending the 3 hours between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. mindlessly, chilling and scrolling through social media just as you're trying to go to sleep, that's probably not a good thing. And if you're spending 5 hours a day plus gaming, that's definitely not a good thing. So it's not about how many hours you spend on screen, is what you do when you're there. And there you do find national differences. As I said, gaming is a bigger deal in China and some other Far Eastern countries.
So a couple of questions. One, Bob did answer about the question of sharing your data and the issues of repressive regimes, which I think Bob very well answered. We've had people join us from Africa, also from Italy. And we've obviously got an interested group in terms of latest trends. And has come up, are the problems that you've so brilliantly outlined in the book, are they, in your opinion, made worse or better with this sort of second life metaverse, as Facebook sort of takes Metcalfe's law and the networking effect into this new incarnation? Do you have a view on that?
I absolutely have a view. So as I understand it, having read up on what metaverse really means, is it's about bringing the next development in virtual reality and augmented reality into everyday use for consumers. Now, it's just like the existing problem. Augmented reality and virtual reality doesn't need to be a bad thing. It can be a good thing, and it can allow us all to spend time in a day in an imaginary world or an augmented world that is perfect. And that's great. We can escape from the real world and go into this augmented reality world and have a great time. The problem is, let's just think about it in the context of chilling and scrolling on Facebook. So adolescent girls, often not just girls and boys, but it's probably a bigger problem on Insta for girls, have the problem that they see on Instagram a perfect world where everyone has the whitest teeth, the best body, the nicest family, the best holiday, the biggest car, whatever it might, the biggest eyelashes, whatever it might be. And unfortunately, comparing themselves against this very high standard of perfection, unsurprisingly, most people will fall short because no one is in the top 1% on all those characteristics. If you then take that forward into the metaverse world, where augmented reality literally makes everything perfect in every sense, because you're in this sort of state of, is it nirvana? Would that be the word? You're sort of it's like social media perfection on steroids. And so I'm not saying augmented reality needs to be bad. I'm simply saying it has the potential to make the existing peer comparison issue, which leads to self-esteem, low self-esteem in adolescents, and not just adolescents, but particularly in adolescents. It allows the potential for that problem to be amplified, and that's something I think we should be very worried about based on what social media appears to be doing to the adolescent well-being of our children today.
Indeed. As people join us, let me remind you, we're in our International Book Club. We've got the marvelous Bob Wigley talking about his book, Born Digital. And I think there's quite a few questions. And what I personally thought was the best part of this book are the actions that, the critical communities involved in this, now foundational part of our society need to take. So it'd be marvelous for you to just pick out, you mentioned some of the actions that adolescents can take, some actions from parents. I know you've had some great sessions in schools. I know you have a view on the networking companies in question, and you're relatively close and influential from a government perspective. So what do you think are the actions that we could all practically be taking in each of those key communities, Bob?
Okay, so let's go through them one by one. For individuals themselves, in theory, you could just start by being aware of how much time you spend on screen and what you're doing when you're there. Most smartphones these days, and indeed most laptops, have programs which will, at the end of a day or the end of a week, will literally show you how long you've spent on screen and what you were doing. And most people aren't aware of the number of hours they spend and how much time in particular they spend on, if you like, the non-work, non-educational, non sort of productive functioning parts of their lives. So number one is be aware how much time you're spending and what you're doing. And then the second thing is, if you think that you're suffering a little from digital overload in some of those areas, let's say social media and messaging or gaming, the next thing to do is simply take off the front page of your smartphone anything that's not really important. So, okay, if you want to keep your email, your work email, your text message, and maybe one messaging app on your front page, put everything else to a second page. So if you want to go onto social media, you actually have to actively think to do it and go there. It's not constantly coming up on the front page of your phone with notifications, buzzes, bleeps, alarms, nice colors, which are all designed by the best neuroscientists in the world to take you there in a flash. So there are a couple of quick things that individuals can do. I have many, many more in the book in a more sophisticated format. Then I think what can parents do? So here's a big deal. We as parents tend to engage with our children on their offline world. We tend to say, what did you do today? Oh, I met Johnny. We went to the park and played football. Or I met, Cynthia. We had a drink in the park. What we don't tend to say is, okay, well, that's all very interesting, but I know you were up till 2 o'clock this morning. What were you doing as a matter of interest between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m.? Like, what were you looking at? Who did you talk to? What issues came to light? And we don't do that because we think that's being intrusive and nosy. But to most Gen Z, because they don't see a boundary or a difference between the on and offline world, it's just the world to them. They wouldn't necessarily see that as, particularly if we go about it in the right way, they wouldn't necessarily see that as intrusive. So the word for parents is engage with your children's online life, not just their offline life. And maybe share your own online experiences, but talk through some of the risks and the differences between on and offline relationships and some of the things that could happen, and see if you can engage your children in that. It's not about police and restrict. It's about engagement and education. So that's parents.
And Bob, on that point, I can entirely concur. The reason I got into social media in LinkedIn and Insta and Twitter was to meet my children and see what they were doing. And now they say to me, could you please not write such stuff? So it's gone full circle. But that is it works. It really does help you enter their world, understand it more, and relate. I think that's really very true.
Well, and not to be ignorant about it and say it's all bad, because it's not all bad.
Exactly.
I mean, what COVID and lockdown taught us is that actually this is the means by which youngsters fundamentally do talk to each other. Not talk in the sense that you and I talk, but through messaging, exchange information with each other. So it's not all bad. It's just that it has the potential to be bad. So as Mary Aiken, the professor, who's probably the leading cyber psychologist in the world, says, it's not a bad internet. You just have users who use the internet badly. So it's about educating them to use it more safely and more responsibly. So that's parents. Then there's the whole software design industry, who today are paid and bonused to design apps that attract your attention and retain it for as long as possible. It's sort of industrialized distraction, if you like. And so what they could do, if they were appropriately motivated, is they could decide to make those apps less distracting, make them more optional, absolutely have great functionality, but just not be designed to attract and retain your eyeballs. Now, all of the things I've been through, whether it be things that Gen Z could do themselves, or we could all do ourselves, whether it be what parents could do, or what the software designers can do, are ultimately unrealistic, because the way the advertising industry works is the platforms are paid to attract your eyeballs and then keep them there as long as possible. So I'm afraid the economics don't really support more responsible internet use. So absent some great change in the motivations of these companies, it's highly unlikely that ultimately we're going to be successful. And I think it was Wu who said, if you've got a half-developed adolescent brain on one side of the screen and 100 of the world's best neuroscientists on the other side of the screen, that's not really a fair fight, is it?
Yeah.
And I think that's true. So actually, it might have been Roger McNamee, not Tim Wu, but anyway, all good people. So that where I'm afraid that leads you is to regulation. Now, here, I think the UK government deserves a lot of credit for what it's trying to do. We have a suite of 4 pieces of legislation, or in a couple of cases, codes, which are holistically designed to attack this problem. So the first is the online harms bill that's going through Parliament at the moment.
Yeah.
That is designed for the first time anywhere in the world to put a statutory duty of care on big tech platforms, social media platforms, to have regard to the harms that their platforms might be causing adolescents, children, minors, and if they identify harms, to take action to mitigate those harms. And Ofcom, our media regulator, will annually review what actions they've taken, and if they deem them to be inadequate, have the ability to fine these companies very substantial amounts of money. That is a world-leading idea. It's being implemented as we speak. Time will tell how well it works, but the idea is a phenomenal one. The second thing is the government has introduced compulsory relationship education in schools. Part of that is a module which explains the difference between on and offline relationships and highlights the risks of online interaction. So that's really important, and that's happening now in schools up and down the country, where teachers are trying to engage with their pupils on this subject and educate them. The third is the age assurance code, which is code, not law, but that is requiring social media platforms to better understand the age of their users and then have regard to the kind of content that's appropriate to that age group to serve up to them. Again, happening as we speak, early days, too early to tell whether it's going to make a big difference. But again, the idea is a good one. But personally, as we previously discussed, I'd much rather have get rid of anonymity, so that we didn't have to age assure people. We just knew how old they were, and then we could be much clearer on what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate. And then the fourth thing is the government set up something called the Digital Markets Unit within the Competitions and Markets Authority, which is examining whether some of these companies have become so big that they are able to abuse their monopolistic or monopsonistic market positions. And if they are, to work out how to address that, given that these companies exist and have developed and are now enormous. So when you take it all together, that's pretty impressive thinking. As I said, too early to tell whether it's going to work. Let's revisit in a year's time and see how much impact it's had. But the ideas are good. If the US adopted a similar suite of legislation, that would be a game changer.
That's interesting. There's lots of agreement online around this, Bob, and that just came up. So taking these to your governments and what we're trialing here would be phenomenal. And a couple of questions have come up. I'm guessing, though I have no age verification, from younger people. For you, Bob, I think this is quite interesting. What do you think is the most positive aspect? I mean, your book is an analytical and thorough review of, as you so brilliantly put it, social media is not here to serve us. It's meant to serve the platform. And you've talked about that. But what do you think for you, your children, your life, your family? What do you think are one or two of the most positive things that you get from social media, apart from the COVID point you made about communication? Do you see merit in some of what is out there?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand that this is not a book that's negative about technology. Okay, I mean, it would be pointless to be negative about technology. Technology is ubiquitous in every aspect of our lives, whether it's searching for information, it's making purchases, it's organizing holidays, it's engaging in politics, it's engaging in religion, it's engaging in sport. It's here, it's big, it's absolutely all over every minute of our lives, and it's here to stay. So being negative about technology will be an entirely pointless proposition, okay? And I'm not negative about it. I am negative about the apparent motivations of some of the players in the industry and some of the effects that their business models have on youngsters. And I'd like to see some reform in that area, but I'm not remotely negative about technology as a subject. Secondly, and most particularly, I am not negative for a second about Generation Z. So the first thing to say is this is a generation that is having to deal with a degree of peer comparison that no generation has had to deal with before. Okay. And let me tell you a little story. When I was 16, I read a book, and the first chapter said, the trouble with people, it was a sort of a well-being book for adolescents. And chapter 1 said, the trouble with people with big noses is they always compare themselves to people with perfect noses, not people with average noses. And just think about that for a minute. If you had a slightly big nose and you compared yourself to the person with the average nose, you go, well, okay, it's a bit big, but it's not the end of the world. If you look at, Tom Cruise or Ryan Reynolds, you go, oh God, they just got this perfect nose and I've got this. By the way, I haven't got a big nose, so it doesn't really apply to me. But anyway, I'm just saying it's as a general point, right? You go, oh God, my nose isn't as good. That's a disaster. And so I'm not as good as them. Now, I guess what social media does is that it applies that principle to every single aspect of us and our lives. And because what we're looking at is in the top 1%, not even above average, it's literally the best. You look at Insta, everything seems perfect, right? Well, no one actually leads a life like that, or practically no one leads a life like that. And I'm afraid what it does, unintentionally maybe, is it presents a world where by definition we all fall short. And so we should not be particularly surprised if a lot of people, and particularly a lot of youngsters, come away from their experiences depressed, unhappy, and anxious, feeling that they fall short in some way or another. So no one should be surprised about it. We just have to be aware of it and think about how we can handle it. And the final thing I want to say is I am not for a second negative about Generation Z. I'm super impressed with Generation Z for the following reasons. We as a generation, you, Harriet, and me, are leaving our kids, I'm afraid, a pretty miserable set of cards, whether it be the continuing war on terror around the world, whether it be the hangover from austerity and the global financial crisis, whether it now be COVID debt, any of these, and whether it be a damaged planet, right? If I was an 18-year-old today, I'd be pretty cross with our generation. I'd say, what are you doing to us, guys? This is not great. But the good news is they are incredibly positive about how they're going to change the world. They think that businesses need to have a purpose which goes beyond simply making money for their shareholders and paying dividends. They need to have a societal purpose which is to do with solving one of these problems. And Generation Z as a group is very entrepreneurial. It's intent on business having a social purpose, and indeed intent on setting up businesses that do nothing but have a social purpose.
Absolutely.
Incredibly entrepreneurial with a social purpose. So I'm super excited about what the next generation is going to do to improve the world that we, I'm afraid, are leaving behind.
Fantastic. And a couple of questions. We've had people join us from Indonesia as well. So I always welcome new countries. One question that I can answer: no, Bob is not profiting, making money from this problem, in that the profits, any profits from this book, he's donating to adolescent charities, which I think is nicer for me to say than for Bob. We've had a couple of people say their favorite quotes from the book. Facebook is where you tell lies to your friends, which is what Bob has just been talking about, this sort of bizarre world. And Twitter is where you tell the truth to complete strangers. So people liked that, from Indonesia to Italy. A question, Bob. We're now the International Book Club. Bob Wigley on his Born Digital. A question that's come up 3 or 4 times in different guises is, responsibility is placed on platforms to police content to prevent the spread of fake news. But how do we manage the risk that this empowers them to also prevent the spread of legitimate news that is merely unfavorable to it and its kind of interest? So, the dominance of certain platforms, a very good example, I think last May, was in conflict again in the Middle East, and very old footage was revamped, reshared to support all sides' view of the enemy in the conflict. So what's your thought around fake news, Bob?
Well, so to go to the slightly wider question which you first asked, I think there are 2 things to say. One is, I think we need to have more regard to the governance of the companies which own these dominant platforms. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second is, we need to think harder about how we regulate content moderation, what's called content moderation. In other words, the obligation, if there was one, on a platform to in some way verify the accuracy of information posted on its platform, which today they don't have. So taking the first, if you look at the boards of, let's say, for example, Google or Facebook, you will find a pretty narrow group of people governing these companies. You will find that they are relatively old, and most of them are very wealthy. There are no youngsters on the board of either of those companies. I think I looked at I think it was Google in the book. I think the average age of the board is 62. I think there was no one under 47. And when you think that the average age of the employees of Google is 29 and the average age of their users is probably well below that, on this board, where is the Generation Z group? Where is the child development psychologist? Where is the teacher? Where is the ex-media regulator? This doesn't look to me like a company that wants any real challenge over its governance. So that's point number one. I think investors in these companies, to the extent they have any power over them, should insist that they have more diverse boards and that they have people on the boards who are prepared to ask the difficult questions that today maybe aren't being asked. I mean, we're not in the boardroom, so we don't know. The second question then is content moderation. Now, this is a pretty nascent industry. Mm-hmm. Today, the platforms themselves are governing how they moderate content in most countries, not in all. So actually, Germany does have very strict laws about spreading hate speech, which of course goes back to its history.
Yes.
But many countries don't. Most countries in the world don't have laws about content moderation. There are academics around the world working with the UN, working with the Oxford Internet Institute, working with the Global Centre for Governance Innovation, I think it's called, to come up with ideas about how you could have some regulation of content moderation. And that would address the problem that your questioner asked about how do you, on the one hand, make sure that you're banning the spreading of fake news, but you're not allowing the amplification of a particular viewpoint that might be the viewpoint of that company. So I hope that sort of gives some idea about how you might address those 2 issues.
Superb. And I think, the sense of this being such a global issue, over 16 countries represented, asking roughly the same questions in different ways, with different nuances. So we're going to be sharing this live recording after this. For those, particularly, I've taken some stick from colleagues who said, well, it's not perfectly timed. For me, you can never have a perfect time globally, but we will share the recording, and then I will give my book review with many of the snippets from this interview and Bob's superb additional points. So I think, Bob, the questions we've asked, the major ones, you've been brilliantly candid and open. Thank you, for writing the book, and to your family for pushing you out of the kitchen and not having an office, so you had to write it. I think a lot of people are grateful for that. There are a couple of questions about what are you going to do next on the book front? What other myths are you going to explode? So I don't know if you can share a secret with us.
So unlikely, I think, having had this experience, to be honest, to write a second book. What I am trying to do is get a documentary made addressing some of the issues in the book. So I'm sure many of your viewers will have watched The Social Dilemma, which is very much around the same subject. Now, it's a great attention raising kind of documentary. It sort of encapsulates the problem. But I would say in a slightly, without being rude, evangelical way, because it's made by a bunch of middle-aged ex-tech executives who some might say, I wouldn't say this, but some might say, well, hang on a minute, you went and made a load of money in tech companies, and now you're having a conversion on the road to Damascus. You're feeling guilty, so now you're trying to expose what they've done. I don't see it like that, but some people do. But the point is this: there were no youngsters in the program. The story was not told by Generation Z. So I want to remake that. And also, by the way, it was a pretty scary documentary that didn't really have any solutions in it. Now, Tristan Harris, who's a great guy and is running the Center for Humane Technology in the States, is all over the solutions, and he's got a whole work program of ideas, some of which are extremely good. And I encourage you to look at them. But I want in the documentary to tell the story through the eyes of, say, 5 youngsters. So someone from the Far East who has become a gaming addict. How, first of all, they enjoyed gaming, then it became a problem, and maybe how they've overcome it. So the good, the bad, and the good. I want to tell the story of someone who became super famous and popular on Instagram, being a fitness model, who then had a nervous breakdown because of the horrendous things that his followers were asking him to do. Took himself off for 10 months, recovered, and then came back and is now training to be an actor and is much more in control of his relationship with the internet. I want to tell the story of a girl from America who lost 4 friends to suicide within 2 years. She thinks because of their overexposure to a particular social media website that led them to get into self-harm and ultimately to commit suicide. And she set up a brilliant charity called No So November. So this is not about either growing a moustache or, if you have one, taking it off in November. It's about digital detox for November. Simply come off all your social media for a month and see how much better you feel. And during that month, use all the spare time you now have to go and do some things around wellness. So they're 3 of the 5, without prefacing the documentary. That's what I want to do next. I want to tell the story through the eyes of youngsters. I want to tell a balanced story, not an evangelical one. And I want to emphasize that the solutions exist. We just have to decide to adopt them.
Well, I think you'll have a whole host of new followers after your wonderful responses. Bob, remember everyone that the profits from the book go to adolescent charities. When we share this live video, we'll share where you can buy the book. I absolutely recommend you read it. If this didn't entice you to read it, then absolutely nothing will. And thank you so much, Bob, for joining us and talking with such candor. And I'm sure I'll be asked to interview you again, and I would do that with great pleasure. So thank you very much.
Well, Harriet, first of all, thank you for taking someone in your position, taking an interest in this, I think, super topical and super important subject. Thank you for asking such great questions, and thank you to your viewers for submitting such great questions. And if you want me back, I'm there. Fantastic.
The questions are rolling in, but I think we are we'll try and answer any that Bob hasn't in our review, etc. But it's just been wonderful to talk to you, and thank you very much indeed to all of you who joined, and to Bob Wigley.
Thank you so much, and please tell me where you got that jacket, because I need to buy it for my wife.
I will do. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.